The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Viper smelled of stale coffee, gun oil, and testosterone. 6 men sat sprawled across folding chairs, their bodies taking up space the way apex predators claim territory. They were SEALs from Team Razorback, and they wore their lethality like a second skin, bearded, tattooed muscles built from protein powder and controlled violence. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the tactical map table. At 6'4", he didn't just command a room, he dominated it. "So Intel says we're getting specialized Overwatch support," Morrison said, examining his fingernails. "Probably some drone operator with soft hands who's never seen an actual combat." Derek Hound Williams, the heavy gunner, laughed while sharpening his knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic scraping sound was deliberate theatrical. "I heard it's some specialist from Benning. Probably can't even carry their own ruck." The door opened. The laughter died like someone had cut its throat. A figure stood in the doorway, so slight she barely cast a shadow under the flickering fluorescent lights. She was 4'9" in her combat boots, maybe 95 pounds soaking wet. Her multicam uniform was tailored, but it still looked like it was wearing her rather than the other way around. On her back, a pelican case nearly as tall as she was rested against the doorframe. Morrison's boots hit the floor with a thud. He squinted past her, looking for the real specialist, the actual operator. Then his gaze dropped, and dropped again, until it met hers. "You've got to be kidding me." Morrison exhaled a laugh, bubbling up cold and sharp. "Did you take a wrong turn? The admin office is 2 buildings over." The woman didn't flinch. She walked into the room with measured steps, her boots making a distinct rhythmic thud on the plywood floor. She dragged the massive pelican case behind her, the wheels rumbling like distant thunder across the uneven boards. She stopped at the front of the room, snapped a salute that could cut glass, and stood at parade rest. "Chief Warrant Officer 3 Emma Rourke reporting for attachment," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of tremors. It wasn't a shout, but it carried to the back of the room with the density of a bullet. Morrison stood slowly, towering over her by nearly 2 feet. He walked a full circle around her, inspecting her like one would inspect a defective parachute. His eyes tracked from her boots to her face, measuring, calculating, dismissing. "Rourke, Sparrow." He gestured to his team with a theatrical wave. "Gentlemen, meet our Overwatch. I hope you pack juice boxes because it looks like we're taking a field trip to daycare." The room erupted. Hound's laughter was loudest, a braying sound that filled every corner. Tyler Viper McKenzie, the youngest at 26, just shook his head in disbelief. Even Doc Patterson, who had 2 daughters back home, looked uncomfortable. "Hey, Sparrow," Hound called out, not even trying to hide his grin. "You need a step stool to see over that rifle case." Emma ignored him completely. She kept her eyes locked on Morrison, her posture parade ground, perfect despite the weight of the case she'd just dragged across the room. "I'm qualified on Platform Commander," Emma said. "I'm here to provide long-range interdiction and reconnaissance for Operation Blindfold." Morrison's smile vanished. He leaned down, invading her personal space, his breath hot against her forehead. "Listen to me, Chief. This isn't a shooting range in Virginia. We're going up into the Kush. Altitude's 10,000 feet. The terrain is vertical. My guys carry 80 pounds of gear." He paused for effect. "You weigh what, 90, 95, sir?" 95. Morrison repeated the number like it was a punchline. "Your rifle weighs 30. Your ammo weighs 20. You are a liability. If you lag behind, I will leave you. If you compromise my team, I will cut you loose." His eyes bored into hers, searching for the crack, the moment when she would break. "Do we understand each other?" Emma looked up. The angle hurt her neck, but she didn't break eye contact. In his eyes, she saw what she'd seen in every commanding officer's eyes for the last decade. Fear that she was weak. Anger that he had to deal with it. "I understand, sir," she said. Then she gestured to the map on the wall behind him. "But you should check your intel on the exfil route." Morrison paused. The room went dead silent. "Excuse me." Emma walked past him to the map, her boots clicking softly on the floor. She traced a finger along the marked extraction route, a low-level flight path through the Salon Pass. "You're planning a low-level extraction through the Salon Pass at 1400 hours tomorrow," Emma said. Her voice shifted, became clinical surgical. "Meteorological data from the agricultural weather stations shows a thermal inversion building in the valley. High pressure meeting cold air from the peaks." Morrison crossed his arms. "We checked the weather. It's clear." It's clear now, Emma corrected him, her finger still on the map. But by 1400, the wind shear in that pass will exceed 50 knots, with updrafts capable of grounding a Blackhawk. The inversion will create a ceiling at 9,000 feet. Your current flight plan has you transiting at 8,500. She turned to face him. If you take that route, you won't be flying out. You'll be walking into a kill box with a high-value target and no air support. The silence stretched across the room like razor wire. Morrison looked at the map, then at his communications officer, Ryan Ghost Sullivan. Ghost shrugged, looking distinctly uneasy as he pulled up weather data on his tablet. She's... Ghost tapped the screen several times. She's right, sir. NOAA data confirms thermal inversion probability at 87% between 1300 and 1600 hours. Wind conditions in the pass will be hazardous to aviation. Morrison's jaw tightened. Emma watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Admit she was right or double down on his authority. If we're walking, Emma continued, her voice matter-of-fact, I suggest you worry less about my pack weight and more about the fact that your current loadout for the saw gunner is too heavy for a rapid ascent on the alternate route. She pointed at Hound. He's carrying 200 rounds of 7.62 belt-fed. That's 30 pounds before weapon. At altitude and a tactical ascent carrying wounded, he'll bonk at 7,000 feet. You'll need to redistribute ammunition across the team or cache some at waypoints. Morrison stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. The mockery was gone from his face, replaced by something harder to read. Irritation, certainly, but also a grudging, unwilling calculation. He hated being corrected. He especially hated being corrected by someone he could pick up with one hand. Sit down, Rourke, Morrison grunted, turning his back to her. Don't speak unless spoken to. Emma didn't sit. She moved to the back of the room, finding a corner in the shadows. She sat on her pelican case, resting her hands on her knees, and watched them. They joked, they postured. Their confidence filled the room like smoke, thick and choking. They didn't know yet. They didn't know that in 36 hours, in the screaming wind and blinding sand, they would be praying to the girl they mocked to save their lives. Emma closed her eyes and began to count her heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Inside that case was the Macmillan TAC-50, a beast of a weapon that had broken shoulders and spirits. It was a rifle built for giants, but she had learned to make it sing. 4, 5, 6, the door opened again. An older man entered and the entire energy of the room shifted. He wasn't in uniform. He wore civilian contractor ACU pants and a faded tan shirt, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that doesn't come from rank. It comes from surviving things that kill other men. Colonel James Brennan was 64 years old. His face was weathered like old leather left too long in the sun. Gray stubble covered his jaw. But his eyes were sharp, predatory, the eyes of a man who had looked through rifle scopes at human targets and never blinked. On his chest, barely visible under his unbuttoned collar, was a faded combat infantryman badge. Morrison stood. Colonel Brennan, sir, with respect, this is a classified briefing. Civilian contractors. I'm cleared for this operation, Commander, Brennan said. His voice was gravel mixed with whiskey, rough but steady. I'm here as an advisor. Theater experience. 14 countries. 4 decades. He glanced at Emma in the corner, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face. Also here to make sure you boys don't get yourselves killed by ignoring good intelligence. Morrison bristled. Sir, we have this under control. Do you... Brennan walked to the map, his movements economical, efficient. He tapped the salon pass. Because your weather brief was 48 hours old. Chief Rourke just gave you real-time analysis that will save your extraction. Question is whether you're smart enough to listen. The SEALs shifted in their seats. Being dressed down by a civilian contractor, even one with Brennan's pedigree, stung their pride. Brennan turned to Emma. Chief Rourke, how long have you been studying this valley? 6 months, sir, Emma said. Weather patterns, terrain analysis, enemy movement cycles. And your assessment of the target compound. Emma stood, walked back to the map. This time Morrison didn't stop her. The compound is here, she said, tapping a cluster of buildings 3,000 meters from the marked observation post. 5 buildings, mud brick construction, high walls. Intel estimates 8 to 12 hostiles. Local militia. She paused. I think that estimate is wrong. Morrison's head snapped toward her. Based on what? Satellite imagery from 48 hours ago shows 3 vehicles in the compound. Yesterday's imagery shows 7 vehicles. That's not local militia rotating. That's concentration of forces. The thermal signature analysis shows at least 25 individual heat blooms during night operations. Emma's finger traced the compound perimeter. Whoever's there brought reinforcements, and they brought heavy weapons. I count at least 2 DSHK positions on the rooftops. Those aren't farmers' guns. Those are crew-served weapons that'll tear through body armor like tissue paper. Ghost checked his tablet again, accessing the classified satellite feeds. His face went pale. She's right, sir. Updated imagery confirms 7 vehicles. Thermal count is 24 distinct signatures. Morrison looked at the map, then at Emma, then back at the map. Intel said 8 hostiles. Intel was wrong, Emma said simply. This is a hardened target, Commander. Not a soft village. If you breach that compound with a 6-man team against 20-plus fighters with heavy weapons and no air support. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Morrison's jaw worked, chewing on words he didn't want to say. Colonel Brennan, Morrison said, his voice tight. Your assessment. Brennan looked at the map, then at Emma, then back at Morrison. The chief is right. This is a meat grinder. You should abort. Wait for proper fire support. The target's in HVT, Morrison said. High-value target. We've been hunting him for 6 months. If we pull back now, he'll scatter. We'll lose him. And if you go in undermanned against superior numbers, Brennan said, you'll lose your team. That's not a command decision. That's pride. The 2 men locked eyes, Morrison's fist clenched and unclenched at his sides. Finally, Morrison turned to Emma. If we go in, he said slowly, can you suppress those heavy weapons? Emma met his gaze. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. He was asking her to save their lives before the operation even started. I can take the north gun, Emma said. 3,010 meters, elevated position, but once I fire, they'll know where I am. You'll have seconds to breach before they redirect. That's all we need, Morrison said. He turned to his team. All right, mission is still go, but we're adjusting. Alternate exfil route through the northern wadi, load redistribution for high-altitude movement, and Chief Rourke provides overwatch and fire support. He looked back at Emma, and for the first time there was something other than dismissal in his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but calculation. Assessment. Don't miss, Morrison said. I won't, Emma replied. She walked back to her corner, sat on her case, and resumed counting heartbeats. Brennan caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. Not approval, just acknowledgement. The briefing continued for another hour. Details, timelines, radio frequencies, contingency plans. Emma absorbed it all, building a 3-dimensional model of the operation in her mind. She would be alone on that ridge, 3,000 meters from her team. No backup, no support, just her, the rifle, and the math. And if the math failed, 7 men would die. She'd been here before, not physically, but mentally. Every operation was the same calculation. Prove yourself or watch good people die because someone decided you weren't capable. The briefing ended. The SEALs filed out, still talking amongst themselves, still joking. Hound made a comment about babysitting the pixie. Viper laughed. Emma stayed in her corner until the room was empty except for Brennan. The old man walked over to her, his movements slow, deliberate. Up close, she could see the scars, one along his jawline, another disappearing under his collar. The kind of scars that came from shrapnel, from being too close to explosions that should have killed you. You did good work in there, Brennan said. The weather call, the vehicle count, you might have just saved their lives. They don't think so, Emma said. They will. Brennan pulled up a chair, sat down with a grunt. His knees popped. I've worked with a lot of operators, Chief. You know what separates the good ones from the dead ones. Emma shook her head. The good ones do the math. They count, they measure. They don't trust their gut, they trust their preparation. He tapped his temple. The dead ones trust their ego. They think because they're big and strong and covered in muscles, the mountain will respect them. He gestured at the now empty room. Those boys are good at what they do, but they're walking into something they don't understand. You do. That makes you the most dangerous person on this operation. I'm not dangerous, Emma said. I'm just accurate. Brennan smiled a thin line that didn't reach his eyes. In our world, that's the same thing. He stood, his knees popping again. Get some rest, Chief. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. And the day after. He didn't finish the sentence. He just looked at her with those predator's eyes, and Emma understood. The day after tomorrow, everything would change. The insertion bird in MH-47 Chinook didn't touch down. It hovered 10 feet off the jagged spine of the ridge, its rotor wash whipping the loose scree into a frenzy of stinging projectiles. The ramp dropped, and the world dissolved into green phosphor and noise. Go, go, go! The crew chief screamed, his voice barely audible over the turbines. Emma threw herself off the ramp. She hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud, the weight of her ruck, 65 pounds of misery, including the disassembled Macmillan TAC-50, driving her knees into the gravel. She didn't stay down. Momentum was the only thing keeping her upright. She scrambled forward, clearing the rotor arc, and dropped into the prone position beside a cluster of rocks. The Chinook peeled away, plunging into the valley darkness, its engines fading to a distant whisper. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the synchronized heavy breathing of 7 humans adjusting to the thin air. Sound off! Morrison's voice crackled over the comms, low and distorted. 1 up. 2 up. Emma waited for her slot in the count. 7 up. All right, Morrison commanded. We have 6 clicks to the overwatch point. Elevation gain is 2,000 feet. We have 4 hours of darkness. Move out. They moved. The seals moved with predatory grace, their strides long and efficient, eating up the ground. Emma didn't have that luxury. For every 1 step they took, she had to take 2. Her legs burned immediately. The rucksack wasn't just heavy, it was a parasitic entity trying to drag her backward off the mountain. The straps dug into her trapezius muscles, cutting off circulation to her arms. Within 20 minutes, the formation stretched. Morrison was pushing the pace. It wasn't operationally necessary. It was a test. He wanted her to fail. He wanted to call a halt site failure to maintain pace and leave her at a rally point so he could proceed with real soldiers. Hey, short stack! Hound's voice came over the inter-team radio, dripping with mock concern. He was rear guard, walking directly behind her. You're breathing hard. Want me to take that heavy gun off your hands? It's almost as big as you. Emma gritted her teeth, tasting copper from exertion. Her response was clipped, professional. -5. Maintain your sector. Just saying, Hound chuckled. No shame in tapping out. This is big boy terrain. Emma switched her radio to receive only. She focused on the ground, illuminated by her PVS-31 night vision goggles. The world was a wash of monochromatic green. Rock, rock, loose shale, rock. She turned the pain into a math problem. Step count, rhythm, inhale for 2 steps, exhale for 2. The terrain shifted. The gradual slope turned into a brutal 45-degree ascent. The air thinned as they crossed the 9,000-foot mark. This was the equalizer. The massive muscle mass of the SEALs, an advantage in close-quarters combat, became a liability in thin air. Oxygen demand for a 220-pound operator carrying 80 pounds of kit was astronomical. Emma, at 95 pounds, required a fraction of that fuel. Her heart rate stabilized at 165 beats per minute, high but sustainable. She stopped fighting the mountain and started climbing it. Her small boots found toeholds the men missed. Her low center of gravity kept her stable on sliding scree where the larger men slipped and cursed. 30 minutes into the steep ascent, the formation began to compress. The rhythmic crunch of boots ahead of her slowed. She saw Viper, the point man, stumble. He recovered, but his chest was heaving. The line was accordioning. They were struggling. Morrison halted the column. Hold up, water break, 2 minutes. Emma didn't stop. She didn't need the water yet, and if she stopped, the lactic acid would seize her legs like concrete. She kept moving, a slow, steady trudge passing Hound. Hey, Hound whispered, breathless. Hold up, Rourke. She ignored him. She passed Ghost. She passed Doc. She moved up the line, a ghost in the green dark, until she reached Morrison at the front. He was leaning against a boulder, taking a pull from his hydration tube. His night vision goggles glowed like demonic eyes. He looked down, startled to see her standing there. She wasn't gasping. She was breathing deeply, controlled through her nose. Ready to move when you are, sir, she whispered. Morrison stared at her. Even through the night vision, she could feel his confusion. He'd expected her to be collapsed at the back, crying for a medic. Instead, she was waiting for him. "Check your spacing 7. Morrison snapped through the bite was gone from his voice, replaced by sullen annoyance. "Don't get ahead of the point." "Just maintaining momentum, sir," Emma said. "Kinetic energy is hard to build back up once lost." Morrison capped his water. "Let's go," he growled to the team. The dynamics shifted in the dark. The joke ceased. The only sound was the struggle of men against gravity and altitude. Emma maintained her position near the front, her legs burning with a fire that felt like purification. She remembered training days at Quantico, instructors who laughed, ruck marches where she vomited bile but refused to quit. This was no different. Pain was just information. And she had learned long ago to disconnect the signal. By the time they reached the ridge line, the sky to the east was bleeding a faint bruising purple. The GPS indicated they'd reached the separation point. "Echo team, hold here," Morrison ordered, his breath coming in short gasps. "Rourke, your nest is 300 meters up that spur." He pointed at a vertical scramble up loose granite, a death trap for anyone clumsy or exhausted. "Can you make it?" Emma looked up at the peak, a black tooth against the lightning sky. "I'll be set in 20 mics." She turned to leave but felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Doc, the medic, the one with daughters. He held out an extra magazine for her pistol. "Don't spend it all in one place," Doc said quietly. It wasn't an apology, but in the language of men who killed for a living, it was acknowledgement. She wasn't a liability. Not yet. She was just a nuisance who could hike. "Keep your head down, Doc," Emma said, taking the magazine. She turned and began the final climb alone, leaving the team behind to descend into the valley toward their objective. As she hauled herself up the jagged rock, the wind hit her. The first warning of violence to come. It screamed over the ridge, tugging at her pack, trying to throw her off the edge. She dug her fingers into the stone found purchase pulled. She was small, yes, but she was built for the crevices where big men couldn't fit. She was the needle. They were the hammer. And the needle was about to thread the eye of the storm. The separation from the team was not just physical, it was ontological. One moment Emma was part of an organism, a trailing limb of a tactical unit. The next she was a singular point of consciousness in a vast, indifferent wilderness. She watched the heat signatures of Echo Team fade into the ravine below. Through her thermal monocular, 7 green ghosts swallowing themselves into the earth. Then she turned her back on them and faced the rock. The designated coordinates for the observation post were a tactical joke. Intelligence had picked a saddle between 2 peaks based on satellite topography, but on the ground it was a bowl of loose scree with 50% obstruction from a jutting granite shoulder. From there she would see half the village half the time. That was unacceptable. Emma scanned the ridge with eyes trained to dissect landscapes into grids of cover and concealment. Her gaze landed on a spur of rock jutting out over the sheer drop-off like a broken tooth. It was terrifyingly exposed to the wind and offered zero retreat. If she took fire there, she had nowhere to go but down, a 2,000-foot drop to the valley floor. It was perfect. She moved with agonizing slowness. At this altitude, sound carried like a bell chime. A dislodged rock clattering down the face could alert a sentry miles away. She placed her boots, deliberately testing weight before committing her center of gravity low. The Pelican case was gone, stashed in a crevice lower down. Now the weapon was strapped to her back, the barrel extending well past her head, snagging on wind. Reaching the ledge required a traverse across a face of slick, icy granite. Emma dug her gloved fingers into a fissure, her boots smearing on rock. The wind gusted, pressing her flat against the wall. For a second, the abyss pulled at her, a silent magnetic promise of release. She closed her eyes, reset her grip, pulled. She rolled onto the ledge, her shoulders screaming. The space was barely 6 feet wide, covered in sharp, jagged shale. She didn't rest. The sun would crest the peaks in less than an hour. She needed to be invisible by then. Emma began the ritual of construction. She unclipped the Macmillan TAC-50 from her pack. In the hands of a larger man, the rifle was a tool. In her hands, it looked like artillery. 50 caliber, bolt action, 35 pounds of machine steel and composite stock. She assembled it with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. The bolt slid home with mechanical perfection that calmed her racing heart. She attached the suppressor, a long cylinder that would dampen the roar, but not the shockwave. Next came the ghillie netting. She pulled it from her pouch, shaking out the jute and burlap. It wasn't just a blanket. It was carefully constructed chaos of colors and textures meant to mimic the dead earth of the Hindu Kush. She draped it over herself and the weapon breaking up the hard, unnatural lines of the rifle barrel in human form. She lay prone behind the rifle, shifting her hips to dig a groove into the shale. She had to mold the ground to her body. She would be here for 12, maybe 24 hours. Comfort was irrelevant. Stability was life. Emma brought the loopholed spotting scope to her eye and dialed the focus. The valley leaped into clarity. 3,000 meters away, the target village was a cluster of mud brick compounds sleeping in the indigo dawn. She could see goats penned in a courtyard. She could see the embers of a dying fire. She reached for the Kestrel 5700 Elite Weather Meter. The small device was her lifeline to understanding the invisible forces that would push and pull her bullets. She held it up, letting the impeller spin. Wind 12 miles per hour, gusting 18. Direction 270 degrees. Temperature 28 Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure 22.10 inches of mercury. Emma frowned. The pressure was dropping faster than forecast. The wind wasn't just moving air. It was turbulent, erratic, eddying around the peaks, creating invisible rivers of force that could push a bullet 10 feet off target at this range. She pulled her logbook from her sleeve pocket. She didn't trust digital memory alone. With a grease pencil, she began to build her range card. She sketched the valley, marking reference points. A burnt-out Soviet tank hull, a lone cypress tree, the minaret of the mosque. She lazed the distances with her rangefinder and wrote them down. Tank 2,650 meters. Tree 2,880 meters. Compound main gate 3,010 meters. 2 miles. At that distance, the bullet would take nearly 5 seconds to arrive. During that flight, the world would turn. The Coriolis effect meant the Earth would literally rotate out from under the bullet as it flew. She had to aim not where the target was, but where the target would be in 5 seconds, while compensating for planetary spin bullet, spin drift, air density, and the capricious wind. It was math so complex, it bordered on art. Emma pulled out her grandfather's journal. The leather was worn smooth from decades of handling. Thomas Rourke had written these entries between 1952 and 1967, recording every long-range shot he'd ever made at competitions across Montana and Wyoming. She flipped to a page marked with a faded ribbon. When the numbers stopped making sense, her grandfather had written in cramped handwriting, "Stop calculating and start feeling." The mountain inn doesn't speak in equations. It speaks in pressure changes and grass bending. If you listen, it will tell you where to aim. Emma closed the journal and tucked it back into her pocket. She keyed her radio, the microphone pressed against her throat. "Echo Actual, this is Overwatch," she whispered. Her voice was flat, stripped of fatigue. "I am set at Alpha 1, Bikram. I have a positive identification on objective. Green on comms, green on ammo." A pause, then Morrison's voice tight and breathless. "Copy Overwatch. Give me what you see." Emma pressed her eye to the spotting scope. The village was waking, smoke rising from cook fires. A woman in a blue burqa crossing a courtyard. Then she saw them. The gate of the main compound creaked open. Not the family members intelligence had predicted. Men. Armed men with slung rifles. AK-74s. Not the older AK-47s usually seen in farmers' hands. These were newer, cleaner. Uniformity in their chest rigs. Radios clipped to their shoulders. Emma's pulse quickened. She began counting. 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. A Toyota Land Cruiser rumbled into the courtyard, armored with crude steel plates welded to the doors. More men dismounted. 12, 14, 18. "Echo Actual," Emma said, her voice tightening. "I have movement in the compound. Multiple dismounts armed. This is not local militia. I count professional gear uniform loadout. These are foreign fighters." "How many?" Morrison asked. Emma kept counting. 20, 22, 25. "Actual, I am counting 25 visible hostiles. That's triple the intelligence estimate. And I have heavy weapons. 2 DSHK machine gun positions on the north and south corners of the main building." These are crew-served weapons, not rifles. The radio was silent for 5 seconds. Emma could hear the rustle of Morrison conferring with his team in the background. Overwatch, are you certain intel briefed 12 hostiles maximum? I'm looking at them right now, sir, Emma said. 25 confirmed, likely more inside. This is a hardened target. These men are trained. They're moving in stack formations. I recommend abort or fire support. Another long silence. Emma watched through the scope as the men moved with purpose, setting up security positions, checking weapons. These weren't farmers cosplaying as fighters. These were professionals. We don't have fire support on call, Rourke. Morrison finally replied, his voice hard. The drones are grounded for maintenance. We are here. We have the element of surprise. If we pull back now, the target moves and we lose him for another 6 months. Emma felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She knew that tone. It was the sound of a man who had decided that the mission was more important than the risk. Morrison, she said, abandoning protocol, if you breach that gate, you're walking into a meat grinder. Those DSHKs will tear the team apart before you clear the fatal funnel. That's why you're up there, isn't it? Morrison's voice dropped an octave. You wanted to prove you could do this job. Do it. Suppress the heavies when we initiate. Can you make the shot or not? Emma stared at the heavy machine gun nest 3,000 meters away. It was a black speck in a soup of morning heat shimmer. The wind was already picking up, gusting unpredictably. To hit that target, she would have to thread a bullet through chaotic atmosphere, aiming 10 feet above and 12 feet to the left of where the gun actually sat, praying the math held. I can take the north gun, she said softly. But once I fire, they'll know where I am. You'll have seconds to breach. That's all you'll get. That's all we need, Morrison said. Echo team, listen up. We are green light. Execute timeline alpha. Emma's hands moved automatically, checking the rifle. She adjusted her elevation turret. Click, click, click. 60 minutes of angle. The turret topped out. She would have to hold over the rest using the reticle. She keyed the radio one more time. Copy actual. Green light. Then she settled her cheek against the stock, felt the cold composite press against her skin, and began to count her heartbeats. 42 beats per minute. Controlled. Steady. The waiting was over. Echo actual to Overwatch. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Send it. Emma squeezed the trigger. It wasn't a pull. It was a press, a steady increase of pressure straight back until the sear broke with a crisp snap. The Macmillan TAC-50 roared a concussive slap that kicked up a cloud of dust despite the suppressor. The stock slammed into her shoulder with brutal force, 12,000 foot-pounds of energy, trying to push through her 95-pound frame. 1,000. The bullet was flying, climbing in its arc hundreds of feet above the valley floor. 1,000. Battling crosswind air density, the rotation of the earth itself. 1,000. Through the scope, the image settled. The gunner on the north roof was lighting a cigarette. He didn't hear the shot. The bullet was traveling faster than the speed of sound. He would be dead before the crack of the rifle reached him. 1,000. The cigarette touched his lips. 5. The gunner's chest vaporized. He didn't fall backward. He simply collapsed straight down as if his strings had been cut. A pink mist, visible even at this distance, hung briefly in the still morning air. Splash, Emma whispered. Target down, north roof clear. Below, the valley exploded into action. Breacher up, breaching, breaching, Morrison's voice screamed over the comms, no longer the composed commander, but a conduit of violence. On the south side of the compound wall, a puff of gray smoke blossomed. The breaching charge. A second later, the dull thump reached Emma's ears, sound traveling slower than light. The seals flowed through the gap like black water, moving with terrifying speed. Inside the scope, it was a silent movie of carnage. Emma saw muzzle flashes from the windows, bright angry sparks. She saw the SEALs returning fire, their suppressed MK-18s flickering like strobe lights. But in her earpiece, it was cacophony. Contact front, hallway left man, down, no he's up, keep moving, flash out. Emma panned the scope, ignoring the main fight. Her job wasn't to watch the show. It was to watch the exits, the flanks, the threats they couldn't see. Squirter East Gate, she called out, spotting a figure sprinting from the rear of the compound. He carried an AK-74 and was moving toward the tree line with purpose. Overwatch, we are engaged. Handle it. Hound yelled, the sound of automatic fire drowning him out. Emma worked the bolt. The brass casing, hot enough to burn skin, ejected into the dirt. She loaded afresh round the mechanical action, smooth and certain. She didn't adjust her elevation dial. No time. She used the reticle hash marks holding 2 mils left to lead the running target. She fired. 4 seconds later, the runner pitched forward, sliding face first into the dust. Target neutralized, Emma said flatly. Back in the compound, the fight had stalled. The foreign fighters weren't breaking. They were holding the fatal funnel of the main hallway, pouring fire into the breach point. "They're dug in," a voice shouted. "Viper, frag out." Suddenly, the center of the compound erupted. It wasn't a frag grenade. The entire second floor of the main building heaved upward. Windows blew out in jagged shards of glass and wood. The roof collapsed inward, swallowing the DSHK emplacement Emma hadn't shot yet. A massive plume of black smoke mushroomed into the sky, instantly obscuring the target area. "Eddie turned off!" Morrison screamed. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. The explosion was huge. Secondary charges. The intel had completely missed the fact that the building was rigged to blow. "Dusty here, ringing but good." "Hound good." "Viper, I'm good. That was close. The stairwell is gone." Emma scanned the smoke, switching her scope to thermal mode. The white-hot bloom of the explosion blinded the sensor for a moment before cooling enough to reveal shapes. Heat signatures. Moving in the rubble. "Actual, I have heat signatures moving in the rubble," Emma reported. "North corner, ground floor. They are flanking you." "Copy. Hound, watch your 6. She watched as Hound spun around, his weapon flashing on the thermal display. The heat signatures of 2 enemies crumpled to the floor. "Clear room, clear. Moving to target room." There was a pause filled only by heavy breathing and the crackle of burning debris. Emma swept the perimeter. The village was waking up, lights flickering on in adjacent houses. The element of surprise was dead. "Jackpot." Morrison's voice came over the net, breathless but triumphant. "I repeat, jackpot. We have the package. He's alive. Cuffing him now." Emma exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. They had him. "Actual, you have multiple military-age males mobilizing in the village," Emma warned. "You stirred the hive. Suggest immediate RTB." "Copy, Overwatch. We are collapsing out. Get us cover." "Roger, I am tracking." The SEALs emerged from the smoke, dragging a hooded figure between them. They moved slower now, burdened by the prisoner and the adrenaline dump. They looked small and fragile against the vast backdrop of the hostile valley. Emma looked up from the scope for a fraction of a second. To the west, the sky was changing. The brilliant blue was fading into a sickly, bruised yellow. The wind, which had been gusting, suddenly died completely. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. Emma looked down at her kestrel meter. The barometric pressure wasn't just dropping. It was in free fall. 21.8, 21.5, 21.2. "Actual," Emma said, checking the device again to make sure she was reading it correctly. "The barometric pressure is crashing. You need to double time to the LZ. The weather is turning." "We see it, Rourke," Morrison replied, his voice tight. "We're moving. Don't tell me how to run. Just shoot anything that chases us." Emma didn't respond. She looked back through the scope. The dust from the explosion wasn't settling. It was hanging suspended in the air, defying gravity. The valley was holding its breath. And on the horizon, a wall of brown was beginning to eat the mountains. The mission was a success. The war was just starting. The silence that followed the gunfire was unnatural. It wasn't the peace of a ceasefire. It was the vacuum before an implosion. Emma lay motionless on her granite shelf, the barrel of the Macmillan TAC-50 tracking the retreating form of Echo Team through the spotting scope. They were moving south through the wadi, a chaotic snake of green bodies dragging the captured warlord. They were moving fast, fueled by adrenaline. But to Emma's eye, they looked agonizingly slow. The terrain was fighting them. Loose shale, knee-deep scrub, the uneven weight of the prisoner who was dead weight in their arms. "Actual, maintain spacing," Emma murmured into the radio. "You have potential squirters on the East Ridge 800 meters out. They are observing, not engaging." "Copy, Overwatch. We are pushing to LZ Sparrow. ETA 10 mics. Get Kingpin on the net. Tell him we are bringing the package hot." Emma shifted her gaze from the scope to the valley floor, then to the horizon. Something was wrong. The light had changed. The harsh, bleached white sunlight of Afghan high noon had taken on a sickly sepia tint. Shadows were losing their edges, blurring into the ground. She glanced at the kestrel meter mounted next to her scope. The numbers were flickering. Barometric pressure 20.10 inches of mercury, 20.05, 19.95. It was plummeting. Kingpin 26, this is Overwatch. Emma keyed the long-range net, bypassing the team channel, requesting status on inbound aviation. Overwatch Kingpin 26. The pilot's voice crackled, sounding thin and distant. We are 2 minutes out, but we are painting heavy weather to the north. Radar is lighting up like a Christmas tree. What are your on-ground conditions? Emma wetted a finger and held it up. The wind, which had been whipping her hair across her face for hours, had stopped completely. The air was dead, heavy. It tasted metallic like copper and ozone. The hairs on her arms stood up against the fabric of her flight suit. Static electricity was building. She looked north past the village, past the valley entrance. The mountains were gone. A wall of earth miles high and stretching across the entire width of the horizon was consuming the world. It wasn't a cloud. It was a solid, churning avalanche of brown suspended in the air. It looked solid enough to crush bone. A haboob. Actual Kingpin weather alert, Emma shouted, abandoning the whisper. Massive atmospheric event inbound from the north. It's a haboob. Wall of dust. Visibility 0 in 30 seconds. Say again, Overwatch. Morrison's voice was incredulous. It's sunny down here. We are 1 click from the bird. Look behind you, Morrison. Through the scope, Emma watched as Morrison stopped and turned. Even at 3,000 meters, she saw his body language shift from aggression to absolute stillness. The wall of brown was towering over the valley, eclipsing the sun. The light vanished instantly, plunging the world into twilight gloom. Kingpin 26 abort. Abort inbound, Emma screamed into the mic. You cannot fly in this. The intake filters will glass in seconds. Visibility is dropping to 0. Wave off. We see it, Overwatch. Holy? The pilot's voice cut off as static filled the channel. Breaking off. Echo actual Kingpin is waving off. We cannot land in that. We are RTB. Good luck, boys. The thumping sound of approaching rotors faded, replaced by a new sound. It started as a low vibration in the rock under Emma's chest. Then it grew into a roar. It sounded like a freight train derailing 1,000,000 tons of sand grinding against stone. No, bring that bird back, Morrison yelled. We have the HVT. We are in the open. Actual, get to cover, Emma commanded, her voice cutting through his panic. You have to find hard cover now. The wadi is going to become a wind tunnel. Where there's nothing here. The ravine to your west, 400 meters. It's a choke point, but it has overhangs. Move. Run. The SEALs scrambled. The order and discipline of the withdrawal disintegrated into a desperate sprint. They dragged the prisoners, stumbling over rocks, slipping on loose earth. The wall hit the village first. Emma watched as the building simply disappeared, swallowed whole by the dust. It was moving at 60 miles per hour. Then it hit her. It didn't start with a gust. It started with a hammer blow. The wind slammed into her perch with such force it lifted her 60-pound rifle case off the ground and hurled it over the cliff edge. She watched it tumble into the abyss, disappearing into the brown void. Emma grabbed the TAC-50, burying her face into the dirt, wrapping her limbs around the heavy weapon to anchor herself. The light died. Day turned to absolute night. The sand wasn't just dust. It was grit, sharp and abrasive, industrial grade. It scoured any exposed skin raw instantly. It filled her nose, her ears, her mouth. She couldn't breathe without inhaling particles that felt like ground glass. The noise was deafening, a constant screaming roar that drowned out her own thoughts. Actual status, she screamed into the radio, but she couldn't hear herself. The static in the earpiece was white noise, a wall of interference. She pulled her thermal blanket over her head, and the scope creating a tiny, suffocating pocket of air. She checked the comms display on her wrist. Signal strength was non-existent. The density of particulate matter in the air was blocking radio waves. She was blind. They were blind. And the enemy, the ones she had seen on the ridge, the ones mobilizing in the village, they were indigenous to this hell. They knew how to hunt in the dark. Emma lay huddled on the ledge, the wind trying to peel her off the mountain. She checked her watch. 14:15 Zulu. The extraction was gone. The air support was gone. The sun was gone. She was alone with 7 men who were 3,000 meters away, separated by screaming darkness in an army of killers who knew exactly where they were. The hunter was now the prey. The world did not fade away. It was erased. One moment Emma had a visual on the valley floor, a topographical map of ridges and wadis rendered in thermal green. The next she was staring into the face of a brownish-red void that had no depth, no dimension, no mercy. The haboob didn't just obscure vision, it swallowed light. At 14:20 Zulu, the sun was blotted out so completely that Emma had to flip her night vision down just to see her own hands. But the PVS-31s were useless. The billions of sand particles whipping through the air reflected the infrared light back into the tubes, creating a blinding wall of static known as blooming. She tore them off, cursing. The wind on the ledge was now a physical assault, a constant 60-mile-per-hour hand trying to shove her into the abyss. Emma flattened herself against the granite, her flight suit snapping violently like a flag in a hurricane. She pulled the thermal blanket tight over her head, and the scope of the TAC-50 creating a crude hood. The fabric whipped and tore at the edges, but it held. "Echo actual status!" she screamed into the radio. Static. A wall of white noise that sounded like bacon frying in a pan. The sand was electrically charged, scrambling the UHF frequencies. She switched to the internal team channel, cranking the squelch down to 0, accepting any signal, no matter how corrupted. "Can't see shit. Where is the wall?" Morrison's voice broke through distorted and tiny stripped of command presence. "I'm blind," Hound's voice. "I can't see my hand in front of my face. The strobe is washing out." Emma pressed her eye to the thermal scope. She switched the polarity to black-hot, hoping the inversion would cut through the interference. The sensor struggled. The air itself was hot now, the friction of billions of sand particles creating a thermal wall. But down in the valley, the heat was different. She saw them. 7 faint, ghostly smudges huddled against a rock outcropping. They weren't moving. They were cowering. "Actual, I have you," Emma said, speaking slowly and clearly, hoping the transmission would cut through the interference. "You are exposed. You are stopped in the open." "Vance, is that, Yuko?" Morrison sounded like a drowning man finding a lifeline. "We can't navigate. The GPS is spinning. Which way is the ravine?" "West. Turn 90 degrees left. Move 50 meters. There is a cut in the rock." "Moving. Echo on me. Left face. Move." Through the thermal scope, the blobs began to move, stumbling, erratic. They were terrified. The Sandstorm had stripped them of their greatest advantages. Air superiority, satellite intel, coordinated movement. They were just men in a blender. Suddenly, a new heat signature flared on the edge of the scope's field of view. It was brighter, hotter. An engine block. Then another. And another. 3 distinct burning rectangles tearing through the storm to the north, moving parallel to the wadi. They weren't stumbling. They were driving with purpose, headlights off, navigating by memory and terrain knowledge. "Actual freeze," Emma yelled. "Contact mechanized. 3 vehicles moving south-southeast. They are cutting you off." "We don't hear them. The wind is too loud." "They are on top of you, Morrison, 200 meters north. They are using the noise to mask their approach." The enemy knew the terrain. They didn't need GPS. They knew the wadi funneled into the ravine, and they were driving blindly toward the choke point to seal it. "Get to the rocks now. Go!" Emma watched the thermal ghosts of the SEALs break into a desperate sprint, but the trucks were faster. The lead vehicle, a Toyota Hilux with a mounted heavy machine gun, slewed sideways, drifting in the sand, and came to a halt directly across the entrance to the ravine. The heat bloom of the muzzle flash was blinding on the thermal screen. Thump, 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 thump. The DSHK opened up. Even over the gale-force wind, Emma heard the rhythmic pounding of the heavy-caliber rounds. It was the sound of death, mechanized and indifferent. "Contact front! Contact front!" The radio dissolved into screams and the chatter of automatic fire. The SEALs dove for cover behind a shallow berm. They were trapped. The enemy truck was blocking their only exit, and the heavy rounds were chewing up the earth around them, sending geysers of dirt and rock into the storm. Emma tried to find a firing solution. She ranged the truck. 2,800 meters. But the wind wasn't just blowing left to right, it was swirling, updrafting, downdrafting, creating a vortex in the bowl of the valley. A bullet fired now would be like throwing a feather into a tornado. The probability of a hit was statistically zero. "Vance, do you see it?" Morrison screamed. "We are pinned. We can't move. Suppress that gun." "I can't take the shot actual," Emma whispered, her hands shaking as she gripped the turret knobs. "The wind is 60 knots. I have no data for this. I can't predict the drift." "I don't care about the math," Morrison roared, desperation cracking his voice. "Shoot the gun or we die right here. That's an order." Emma looked through the scope. The DSHK was pouring fire into the SEAL position. She saw a heat signature. Miller maybe flinch and roll back behind cover. "Man down. Miller is hit." The stakes had just shifted. It wasn't about math anymore. It was about chance. Emma dialed the windage knob all the way to the right, then held the reticle further into the black void of the storm. She was aiming at nothing. She was aiming at where she felt the wind wanted the bullet to go. "Firing blind," she hissed. She exhaled, feeling the grit crunch between her teeth, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle slammed back. She racked the bolt immediately, keeping her eye on the scope. 5 seconds. The DSHK kept firing. "Miss," she whispered. The bullet had vanished into the chaos, swallowed by the storm without a trace. "Impact negative. They're still firing," Morrison yelled. "Do it again." "I don't know where it went," Emma shouted back, panic rising in her throat like bile. "I have no splash. I can't correct." The storm had stolen her feedback loop. Without seeing where the bullet landed, she couldn't adjust. She was throwing rocks in the dark, and her friends were bleeding out. The second and third trucks pulled up, flanking the first. More heat signatures spilled out. Infantry. They were spreading out, forming a semicircle around the pinned SEALs. It was a kill box. A textbook execution setup. And the only person who could stop it was a 4'9" woman perched on a cliff, blinded by the very element she was supposed to master. "Echo is combat ineffective." Morrison's voice was a whisper, now hollow. "We are fixing bayonets. It's been an honor." "No," Emma said. She closed her eyes, shutting out the thermal chaos. She felt the wind on her cheek, violent and angry. She listened to the roar, trying to find pattern in pandemonium. She stopped trying to fight the storm and tried to become it. She remembered her grandfather's journal, the entry from 1959, a competition in Wyoming. Winds so strong they canceled the event. Except Thomas Rourke didn't leave. He stayed on the range alone and fired 100 rounds, recording every result. When numbers fail, he had written, "Listen to what the mountain is telling you. Wind is not random. It breathes. It pulses. Find the rhythm and ride it." Emma stripped off her right glove. The cold wind bit into her skin instantly, sanding her fingertips raw. She placed her bare hand on the rock ledge. She felt tremors. The wind wasn't a constant stream. It was a pulse. Surge, scream, lull, surge. There was a rhythm to the chaos, a pattern in the turbulence, hidden beneath the violence. She put her hand back on the grip, her skin touching the freezing composite stock. She settled her cheek onto the weld, feeling the familiar pressure. "Actual," Emma said. Her voice was suddenly terrifyingly calm. The panic had burned itself out, leaving only cold, hard resolve. I'm engaging. Keep your heads down." She looked through the scope. The white-hot barrel of the DSHK was her anchor, the one constant in the maelstrom. She didn't look at the windage dial. She didn't look at the elevation chart. She looked at the storm. She watched the way the dust flowed past the objective, visible only in the thermal gradient. It was moving right to left, violent and fast, but in pulses. Surge. The dust thickened, visibility dropped to nothing. Scream. The roar peaked, shaking the ground. Lull. The pressure eased for just a heartbeat. At 3,000 meters with a 50-mile-per-hour full-value crosswind, the bullet would drift nearly 30 feet. That was the length of a bus. She had to aim at empty space and at a patch of swirling darkness so far to the right of the truck that it felt like madness. She had to trust that the wind would carry the bullet into the path of the enemy. She moved the crosshairs off the truck, past the flanking infantry, past the rock outcropping, settling the reticle on nothingness in the storm. "Wind catch," she whispered to herself. She waited. She felt the wind battering her legs. Surge. The scope shook. Scream. The visibility dropped. Then the pressure eased. The roar dipped slightly. The lull. Now, she didn't snatch the trigger. She pressed it straight back, letting the surprise of the break catch her. Boom! The rifle bucked, driving the bipod legs into the shale. The recoil was a sledgehammer to her shoulder, and she felt something tear deep in the muscle. "Shot out," she whispered. She cycled the bolt instantly. Clack, clack. A fresh round slid into the chamber. 1, 2, 3. She didn't blink. She watched the thermal image of the truck. 4, nothing happened. The DSHK kept firing. Thump, thump, thump. She had missed again. 5. The heat signature of the gunner vanished. It didn't fall. It disintegrated. The upper torso of the gunner simply ceased to exist on the thermal display, blown apart by the 50 caliber round that had found its target after a 5-second journey through hell. The heavy machine gun fell silent instantly. "Target down!" Emma screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "Direct hit gunner is down!" For a second, there was only static. Then a voice choked with disbelief. "Confirmed. Jesus Christ, confirmed." The gun stopped. "I have the range," Emma said, her hands trembling as she chambered the next round. "I have the wind. Don't move, Echo. I'm clearing the board." The math was gone. She wasn't calculating anymore. She was feeling the storm. And for the first time, she was the deadliest thing in it. The death of the gunner bought the SEALs perhaps 10 seconds of life. Through the thermal scope, Emma watched the body cool rapidly against the white-hot metal of the truck bed. But the machine was not dead. She saw movement on the passenger side. Another heat signature scrambling up the wheel well, reaching for the spade grips of the DSHK. "They're remanning the gun," Morrison screamed over the radio. "Vance, put it down." Emma didn't answer. She was already cycling the bolt. The brass casing flew out, spinning in the dark, and landed on the growing pile of spent shells next to her leg. She pushed the bolt forward, stripping a new round from the magazine. This wasn't standard ball ammunition. The tip was painted green and white. It was an MK211 Mod 0 Raufoss round, high-explosive incendiary armor-piercing, designed by Norwegians to kill machinery. Inside the bullet sat a tungsten carbide penetrator and a charge of RDX explosive. It didn't just punch a hole. It burrowed inside and detonated. "Adjusting," Emma whispered. The wind howled a banshee scream that tore at her ghillie suit. The lull she had found before was gone. The storm was angry now, swirling with chaotic violence that defied prediction. Emma gritted her teeth. Her shoulder throbbed with deep, dull ache that radiated down her arm. The TAC-50 was a sledgehammer, and she was the anvil. Every shot was a micro-concussion to her skeletal structure. She looked at the truck. The new gunner was swinging the DSHK around, searching for targets through the dust. "Don't shoot the man," she told herself. "The man is renewable. The machine is the threat." She shifted her aim lower below the gun shield, below the driver's compartment. She aimed for the glowing rectangular block in the chassis. The engine, specifically the fuel rail running along the block. Distance 3,010 meters. Time of flight 4.8 seconds. Drop 4,200 inches. Windage immeasurable. She had to feel it again. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, letting the tremors of the rock travel up through her chest. The mountain was vibrating with the wind. Push, push, release. She opened her eyes. The crosshair was floating in the black void of the storm, aiming 20 feet to the right of the truck. It looked wrong. It looked insane. To hit the target, she had to aim at a completely different grid square. "Send it," she whispered. She pressed the trigger. Crack. The recoil slammed her backward, sliding her body an inch on the loose shale. Dust puffed up around the muzzle, instantly snatched away by the gale. 1,000. The new gunner opened fire tracers from the DSHK, lashing out blindly into the ravine, chewing up the rocks where Echo Team lay prone. 1,000. Emma held her breath. The bullet was fighting the air, spinning at 200,000 RPM, burning its way through the wall of sand. 1,000. "Come on," she hissed. 1,000. On the thermal screen, a spark appeared. It wasn't the dull splash of lead on dirt. It was a brilliant, blinding flash of white light. The Raufoss round struck the engine block of the Toyota. The tungsten penetrator shattered the cast iron, and the incendiary charge ignited the fuel vapor instantly. 5. The truck didn't just stop, it erupted. A massive bloom of heat washed out the thermal sensor, completely turning the entire display white. Even from 2 miles away through the roaring wind, the explosion was a distinct event. A bass thump that Emma felt in her chest. The fuel tank caught a second later, turning the vehicle into a fireball, visible even through the brown murk of the haboob. The DSHK stopped firing. The gunner was thrown from the bed of the truck, a burning ragdoll tossed through the air. "Impact!" Emma shouted, her voice cracking. "Target destroyed! Vehicle is burning!" Down in the ravine, there was stunned silence. The SEALs huddled in the dirt watched the fire raging in the storm. It was a lighthouse in the brown dark, a beacon of impossible violence delivered from the heavens. "Actual Hound." Miller's voice came over the net, breathless and disbelieving. "Did you see that she blew the whole damn truck?" Morrison didn't respond immediately. When he did, the tone was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by bewildered awe. "Good hit, Overwatch," Morrison said, his voice quiet, stripped of ego. "That was one hell of a hit." "I have 2 more vehicles," Emma said, cutting him off. She didn't want praise. She wanted ammunition count and threat assessment. "They are breaking formation. Infantry is dismounting. They know where I am now." She was right. The element of surprise was gone. The tracers from the remaining 2 trucks weren't aiming at the SEALs anymore. They were tilting up, probing the ridgeline. Red streaks began to zipper through the sky above her position. They couldn't see her, but they knew the angle. They were firing at the mountain, hoping to catch the ghost. Emma stayed prone. A round cracked overhead, snapping like a whip, the sonic boom of a projectile passing close. "They're searching for me," she said, working the bolt again. Clack, clack. "I need to suppress the infantry before they flank you." "Echo, can you move?" "Negative," Morrison replied. "We have wounded. We are combat ineffective until you clear those other 2 trucks." "Roger." Emma wiped a smear of grit and sweat from her eye, leaving a streak of mud across her face. The first shot was luck. The second was intuition. Now she had to do it 7 more times while the mountain around her disintegrated under heavy machine gun fire. She looked at her hand. It was trembling not from fear, but from muscular fatigue and the early stages of rhabdomyolysis. She forced it still against the stock. "Okay, Emma," she whispered to herself, using her own name like a command. "Be the needle. Be the smallest thing in the world." She centered the crosshairs on the second truck, watching heat signatures spill out the back. Infantry, armed, moving to flank. The mountain began to disintegrate around her. The enemy had stopped aiming at the SEALs and turned their rage upward. The 2 remaining technical trucks were raking the ridgeline with heavy machine gun fire. 12.7mm rounds slammed into the granite face 50 feet below Emma's position, shattering rock and sending geysers of stone shards flying into the storm. They didn't know exactly where she was, but they knew the angle. They were playing a game of probability, saturating the cliff face in hopes that one lucky round would find flesh. Emma didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She lay flat, pressing her body into the depression of the ledge, letting the ghillie suit absorb the debris raining down on her back. "Actual sit rep," she whispered. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the chaos screaming in her earpiece. "We are pinned," Morrison yelled. "We can't lift our heads. We are going Winchester on primaries. I have 2 mags left per man. If they flank us, we are done." Winchester, the code for out of ammunition. The SEALs were about to be reduced to pistols and knives against a mechanized force. Emma swept the thermal scope right. The burning wreck of the first truck created a massive heat bloom that washed out the center of the image. But on the periphery, she saw them. 4 heat signatures. Infantry. They had dismounted from the rear truck and were moving low crab walking through the scrub brush to the east. They were using the noise of the remaining DSHK to mask their movement, flanking the SEAL position. "Actual, you have 4 dismounts moving to your right flank," Emma reported. "They will be on top of you in 60 seconds. "We can't see them. The dust is too thick." "I see them." Emma adjusted her position. The movement sent a jolt of agony through her right shoulder. She could feel the tissue swelling, the bruise spreading like spilled ink beneath her skin. The recoil of the TAC-50 was cumulative punishment. After 3 shots, it hurt. After 4, it bruised. She had fired 6. Her pectoral muscle felt like it had been struck with a baseball bat. The skin under her flight suit was already turning a deep, angry purple. She ignored it. Pain was just a signal. She had disconnected the signal long ago. She focused on the lead infantryman. He was moving fast, hunched over an AK-74. He was 2,900 meters away. The problem was sound. If she fired now, the muzzle blast would cut through the wind. The enemy gunners on the trucks would see the flash or hear the crack, and they would correct their aim. They would walk those heavy rounds right up to her ledge. She had to become a ghost. She listened to the wind. It was a living thing, a rhythmic beast. It would build, scream like a jet engine, then taper off. Wait for the scream, she told herself. She tracked the lead runner. He was closing the distance, 50 meters to the SEAL's blind spot. The wind began to rise. A low moan deepened into a roar. The sand lashed against her scope lens, scratching the coating. Not yet. The roar intensified. It shook the ground beneath her, a physical vibration that made her teeth ache. Now, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked violently. The sound of the shot was instantly swallowed by the gale, absorbed into the greater roar of the storm. To the men in the valley, it was just another crack of thunder in the tempest. Down below, the lead runner simply crumpled. He didn't scream. He dropped face first into the sand, his heat signature slowly beginning to fade as the ground absorbed his warmth. One down, Emma whispered. The other three didn't stop. They didn't know their point man was dead. The visibility was so poor they thought he had just gone prone. Emma worked the bolt. Her arm was trembling. Now the physical effort of cycling the heavy action while lying prone was exhausting. She forced the round home with a grunt. She shifted to the second man, waited for the wind. It didn't come. The lull stretched out, unnatural and ominous. The runner was getting closer. 30 meters from the SEAL position. Vance, they're close. I can hear them shouting. Morrison's voice was panic-stricken. Stand by! She couldn't wait for the wind. She had to trade concealment for speed. She fired. The shot cracked through the lull, sharp and distinct. The second runner spun around, hitting the shoulder. The kinetic energy of the .50 caliber round tore his arm off at the socket. He fell, writhing, his screams inaudible in the storm, but his agony visible in the thermal display. Immediately, the tracers from the trucks shifted. They walked up the cliff, face closer this time, bracketing her position. A round struck the ledge 10 feet to her left. Stone fragments sprayed her face, cutting her cheek. Warm blood trickled down her neck, mixing with the grit and sweat. They have me, she said calmly into the radio. Sparrow status, Morrison demanded. Suppressing, she replied. She didn't retreat. She cycled the bolt again, the action rough with accumulated grit. 2 targets left. They had stopped moving. They were confused, looking up at the mountain, trying to spot the muzzle flash through the brown haze. That was their mistake. They stopped. Emma didn't wait for the wind. She didn't wait for the pain to subside. She aimed at the third man and fired. He dropped. She cycled again, fast and brutal, ignoring the scream of protest from her shoulder. She fired at the fourth man. He dropped. Flank is clear, she said, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. 4 tangos down, right side is clear. The heavy machine gun fire was now hammering her position with renewed intensity. It wasn't random anymore. They were bracketing her, walking the rounds up the cliff face in a pattern. Rounds were cracking overhead, the sonic booms overlapping into a continuous shriek. She was pinned. I am taking heavy fire, she said. I have to displace. You have a window. Move now. Copy. Moving. Echo on me. Go, go. Emma grabbed the barrel of the rifle. It was scorching hot even through her gloves. She dragged the weapon backward, crawling on her stomach, scraping her body over the sharp shale. Bits of rock tore through her flight suit, shredding the fabric and the skin beneath. She slid into a deep fissure, just as a 12.7mm round obliterated the rock where her head had been 3 seconds ago. The impact was so close, she felt a shockwave, a physical slap of overpressure that made her ears ring. She huddled in the crevice, panting, her breath coming in short gasps. Her shoulder was on fire. Her face was bleeding. She tasted copper and grit. She checked the magazine. 2 rounds left. She reached into her vest and pulled out her spare magazine with shaking hands. She dropped it. The metal magazine clattered against the rock, bouncing once before coming to rest. Focus, Emma, she hissed at herself. She picked up the magazine, her fingers clumsy with fatigue, and jammed it into the magwell. It seated with a click. 10 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. 11 shots. That was all she had left to fight a war. She looked up at the sliver of sky above the crevice. It was brown and angry, the color of old blood. Overwatch is displaced, she radioed, her voice regaining its icy calm. Resetting. Give me targets. She crawled back up toward the lip of the fissure, every movement calculated to minimize exposure. The storm wasn't done with her, and neither were the men who wanted her dead. Through the thermal scope, she watched the seals moving. They had made it to better cover deeper in the ravine, but they were still trapped. The two remaining trucks held the high ground, blocking their escape route. And then Emma saw it. A third vehicle, one she hadn't accounted for, was moving. Not toward the seals, but perpendicular to them. A larger truck, heavily armored, with welded steel plates covering the cab and bed. It wasn't maneuvering for position. It was accelerating, building speed, heading directly toward the seal position in a straight line. Contact, Emma screamed into the radio. Vehicle moving, fast mover southbound. It's coming right for you. We see it, Viper yelled. Engaging. Down in the valley, the seals dropped to one knee and opened fire. Small arms tracers zipped toward the truck, sparking harmlessly off the improvised armor plating. The truck didn't slow down. It roared over the uneven ground, bouncing violently, closing the distance at terrifying speed. It's a VBIED, Morrison shouted. Suicide runner. Spread out. Spread out. A vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. A rolling bomb. If it got within 50 meters, the blast wave alone would turn their internal organs to jelly. Vance, stop it, Morrison pleaded, his voice breaking. Stop that truck! Emma forced her eye to the thermal scope. The truck was a white-hot blur moving fast. Too fast. Distance 2,400 meters. Target speed approximately 40 miles per hour. 60 feet per second. Time of flight 3.8 seconds. The math crashed into her brain like a physical blow. She had to lead the target. She had to aim where the truck would be in 4 seconds. But the truck was moving across her field of view, and the wind was pushing against the bullet from the opposite direction. Leading, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She swung the rifle barrel, tracking the truck. It felt impossibly heavy, like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She tracked past the grill, past the hood, past the empty air in front of it. 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet. She had to aim nearly 100 feet in front of the moving vehicle to account for flight time and wind drift. She was aiming at a patch of empty sand, trusting physics and prayer in equal measure. Too fast, she hissed. It's moving too fast. If she missed, she wouldn't get a second shot. The truck would close the gap before she could cycle the bolt. They're not stopping, Hound screamed over the radio. It's too close, 500 meters. Emma stopped tracking. She stopped trying to calculate the perfect intercept. She looked at the terrain instead. Ahead of the truck, about 200 meters, there was a shallow dip in the wadi, a dry wash where erosion had carved a channel and the ground rose sharply on the other side. The truck would have to hit that dip. It would compress the suspension. It would slow down just for a fraction of a second. Trap set, she murmured. She moved her crosshairs to the lip of the rise where the ground met sky. She held the aim steady, ignoring the moving target behind it. She wasn't chasing the truck. She was waiting for it to drive into her bullet's path. Wait for it, she whispered. The truck roared closer, the heat signature growing larger, filling the scope. Vance now, shoot now, Morrison's voice was raw terror. Wait! The truck hit the dip. The front end dipped down, slamming into the earth, then bounced up as it crested the rise, exposing the undercarriage, the front axle, and the oil pan. Now! Oh! She squeezed the trigger. Boom! The Macmillan kicked her shoulder, a dull, sickening thud against the bruised meat. She felt something tear deep inside, but she didn't care. 1, 2, 3. The truck crested the rise airborne for a moment. 4. The round impacted. It didn't hit the driver. It hit the front left wheel hub, punching through the steel and detonating inside the suspension assembly. The kinetic energy of the .50 caliber Raufoss round, combined with the truck's forward momentum, was catastrophic. The wheel sheared off, completely torn from the axle. The front corner of the truck dug into the ground like a plow. The vehicle cartwheeled. The massive steel box flipped end over end, spraying sand and metal parts into the air in a dramatic arc. It rolled once, twice, 3 times, each impact shedding pieces of armor and framework. It finally slid to a halt on its side, a smoking, twisted ruin 200 meters from the SEAL team. Emma cycled the bolt immediately, her eyes never leaving the scope. She expected the explosion, waited for the whiteout of detonating explosives. But it didn't come. The truck lay on its side, smoking but intact. The wiring had likely severed in the crash, or the trigger mechanism had failed. "Vehicle disabled," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. She slumped over the rifle, her forehead resting on the cold scope cap. "Target is stopped. Don't go near it. Just get out." "Stopped?" Morrison's voice was incredulous, bordering on hysterical. "You flipped it. You flipped the whole damn truck." "It was the axle," Emma mumbled, slurring her words now. The edges of her vision were black, closing in like a tunnel. "Just go home." "We are moving. LZ is in sight," Morrison said, his voice regaining some composure. "Vance, can you move? Can you make it to the extraction?" Emma lifted her head with effort. The world spun a nauseating carousel of brown and gray. She looked at the empty magazine well. She looked at the last round sitting on the rock next to her, the final cartridge from her spare magazine. She picked it up. It felt heavy, like a gold bar, like the weight of 7 lives compressed into copper and lead. She loaded it into the chamber and closed the bolt with a definitive click. "I have 1 round left," she said, each word an effort. "I'm not leaving until your wheel's up." "We're not leaving you, Sparrow," Morrison said firmly, and there was something new in his voice, something that hadn't been there before. "Get your gear. Start walking down. We will hold the bird." "Negative," she said, her jaw set despite the exhaustion. "I'm slower than you. If I come down, I slow you down. The storm is lifting. If the storm lifts, the others will see you." She looked out at the horizon. The wall of brown was thinning, shredding at the edges. The sun was trying to punch through a hazy white disk in the sky. "Get to the bird, Morrison," she ordered, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "I'll cover the rear. Come get me when it's safe." She knew it might not be safe for a long time. She knew she was stranded on a ridgeline in hostile territory with 1 bullet and a body that was shutting down. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt like the mountain itself, ancient and immovable. "Go," she said, and she put her eye back to the scope, keeping watch over 7 men who had learned too late what she was capable of. The end of the storm was as sudden as its arrival. The wind, which had been a constant physical assault for 3 hours, didn't just fade. It collapsed. The wall of brown particulate matter began to settle, gravity finally reclaiming the sand that had been suspended in defiance of natural law. The sun, previously a dim white coin, glimpsed through the murk, sharpened into a blinding gold disk that hurt to look at. Emma lay draped over the Macmillan TAC 50 like a discarded coat. Her body was a catalog of damage. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, split by dehydration and grit. Her right eye was swollen shut, the lid puffed up and discolored from impact debris. Her shoulder felt like shattered glass grinding against itself with every breath. She watched the world come back into focus, revealed like a photograph developing in solution. The valley floor was a scene of absolute devastation. The wreckage of the VBIED was a twisted black scar on the beige sand, still smoking gently, heat waves rising from the torn metal. The second truck she had hit earlier was a burnt-out husk, the frame warped from internal fire. Bodies lay scattered in the scrub brush, tiny motionless shapes that would be someone else's problem. And far below, near the extraction point, 7 green figures were waving infrared strobes in the growing daylight. "Kingpin 26 is inbound." The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, clear and crisp now that the static interference was gone. "We have visual on the LZ. Conditions are green, coming in hot." Emma tried to push herself up to get to her knees, but her arms trembled so violently they collapsed beneath her. She stayed prone, accepting the limitation. She was safe. They were safe. The math had held when it mattered most. The thumping of rotors echoed off the canyon walls, a beautiful sound, mechanical and reliable. 2 MH-60M Blackhawks swept low over the ridge, their downdraft kicking up a fresh cloud of dust that swirled in miniature mimicry of the haboob. They banked hard, flaring their noses to bleed speed before settling onto the valley floor with practiced precision. "Echo is moving to the bird," Morrison reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We have the package. Counting heads. All up." Emma watched through the scope as the SEALs boarded the lead helicopter. They moved with the sluggishness of men who had seen death too close, who had burned through every ounce of adrenaline and now moved on willpower alone. They threw the prisoner inside, then scrambled aboard, collapsing onto the troop benches. But the helicopter didn't lift. The rotors continued to turn, but it remained firmly on the ground. Kingpin, hold on the deck. Morrison's voice cut through the radio traffic, sharp and commanding. We are missing one. Overwatch is still high. We're burning fuel, actual. The pilot warned, professional concern evident in his tone. I can't sit here long. The locals are waking up. I am not leaving her, Morrison said, and the command was absolute, brooking no argument. Fly up there and get her. Copy. Guide us in. The lead Black Hawk lifted, nose dipping down as it transitioned from hover to forward flight, beginning the climb. To Emma, lying on her granite shelf, the machine looked like a giant predatory insect rising to meet her all angles and purpose. As it gained altitude, the perspective shifted. Inside the helicopter, Morrison and the rest of Echo Team were looking out the open bay doors, watching the valley floor drop away beneath them. They passed the burnt trucks, dark scars on the landscape. They passed the bodies sprawled in final poses. They kept climbing the altimeter, spinning higher. Past the 1,000-meter mark. Past 2,000. Past the sheer cliff face where the counter-sniper had fallen hours ago, his body somewhere in the scree below. For the first time, the SEALs saw the distance. The true unfiltered distance. They saw the impossible geometry of the shots. They looked down at the smoking wreckage of the VBIED, a tiny speck miles away in the valley floor, and then looked up at the ridgeline where Emma was perched, a position so high and remote it seemed to belong to eagles, not humans. My God! Hound shouted over the intercom, his voice audible to Emma through the radio link. His tone was stripped of mockery, replaced by something like religious awe. She hit that truck from here. She hit everything from here. Morrison was staring out the door, one hand gripping the overhead strap, his face unreadable behind his ballistic sunglasses. She hit everything, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Everything. The Black Hawk hovered level with Emma's ledge, the pilot holding the aircraft steady against the updrafts and wind shear, the rotor tips mere feet from the granite wall. The precision required was extraordinary, threading the needle between cliff face and empty air. Overwatch, we can't land! The crew chief yelled, leaning out on his safety harness, his voice competing with the turbine whine. You have to jump. Come to the door. Emma forced her body to move. It took 3 attempts. On the first 2, her muscles simply refused the command, locked in place by exhaustion and trauma. On the third, something deeper than muscle took over, some reserve of will that existed beyond the physical. She grabbed the barrel of the TAC-50. It was her anchor, her identity compressed into 35 pounds of steel. She dragged herself to her knees, the world tilting dangerously. Then to her feet, swaying like a drunk, the horizon refusing to stay level. She looked at the open door of the helicopter. 7 pairs of eyes were locked on her, and there was no mockery in them now. No laughter, no dismissal. There was only terrified, reverent silence, the kind reserved for things that shouldn't be possible but are. She took a step toward the edge. The wind from the rotors threatened to blow her off the ledge, a 60-knot downdraft that pushed and pulled simultaneously. She leaned into it, clutching the rifle case she had somehow retrieved in her dazed state. The weapon was naked in her hands, no time for proper packing. Come on, Sparrow! Hound screamed, reaching his hand out across the gap. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, his eyes wide. Jump! She stepped off the ledge. For a second, she was falling the abyss, claiming her 2,000 feet of empty air beneath her boots. Then strong hands grabbed her flight suit, rough and urgent. Miller and Morrison hauled her inside, dragging her across the diamond plate floor like a landed fish. Her boots scraped against the metal, and then she was in, surrounded by the smell of aviation fuel and human sweat. The crew chief yelled into his mic, "Clear, go, go, go!" And the Black Hawk banked violently, the pilot throwing the aircraft into a diving turn, back toward the valley floor to gain airspeed and distance from the mountain. The G-forces pushed Emma against the bulkhead, and she let them, unable to resist. She collapsed against the cold metal wall, hugging the rifle to her chest like a child with a teddy bear. Her head fell back, and she closed her eyes against the spinning, the nausea, the overwhelming sensory input of safety after endless hours of controlled terror. She felt a hand on her shoulder, gentle despite the calluses. She flinched instinctively, her body still in combat mode, unable to distinguish threat from comfort. "Easy," Morrison's voice said close to her ear, pitched low beneath the engine noise. "Easy, Chief. You're safe now." She opened her one good eye, the left one still functional. Morrison was kneeling in front of her, and he looked destroyed, exhausted. His face was caked in dust and dried blood from a cut above his eyebrow. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline dump catching up with him. He looked at the rifle in her arms, the weapon he had mocked as too big for a girl. Then he looked at her face, really looked at her, seeing past the size to something else entirely. He reached out and unclipped a canteen from his belt. He didn't hand it to her, recognizing that her hands were occupied with holding herself together. Instead, he unscrewed the cap with deliberate care and held it to her lips, tilting it gently, the gesture oddly intimate in its caretaking. "Drink," he said simply. Emma took a sip. The water was warm and tasted of plastic and chemicals, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was liquid proof that she was still alive, still human, still capable of sensation beyond pain and calculation. She swallowed and pulled away her throat, working around the unfamiliar act of drinking. She looked around the cabin. Every SEAL was staring at her, their faces reflecting various stages of processing what they had witnessed. The dynamic had broken, shattered like the rocks under machine gun fire. The hierarchy of size and strength had been obliterated by the undeniable reality of ballistics and mathematics and one woman's refusal to fail. "Did we get him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the turbines rough as gravel. Morrison nodded, jerking a thumb at the hooded prisoner, cowering in the back of the aircraft, zip-tied and thoroughly defeated. "Yeah, we got him." "Good," Emma said, and she leaned her head back against the bulkhead, closing her eyes again. The vibration of the helicopter was soothing now, a mechanical lullaby carrying her away from the mountain, from the storm, from the place where she had killed 9 men and saved 7 others, and proven something that shouldn't have needed proving, but always did. The adrenaline was gone completely, now drained away like water from a broken container, leaving only hollow ache and bone-deep fatigue. 2 miles, she heard Miller whisper to Viper, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that would take days to fade. She shot the engine block at 2 miles. In a sandstorm, with a crosswind that would ground helicopters. "Shut up," Morrison snapped at them, but his tone lacked heat. "Let her sleep." Emma didn't sleep. Sleep was too far away, too much effort. She just listened to the sound of the rotors taking her home, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump that marked the distance growing between her and the hell she had ruled for 6 impossible hours. She was 4'9". She weighed 95 pounds. And she was the heaviest thing on that bird, weighted with the knowledge that size had never mattered. That doubt was just noise, and that math, when applied with will and desperation and grandfather's wisdom, written in fading ink, could bend reality itself. The rotors beat on, carrying them all toward whatever came next. The ramp dropped at forward operating base Viper. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft, pulling the hooded prisoner out, checking the SEALs who waved them off. They saw Emma, sitting on the bench legs, dangling boots not touching the floor. Her face was dried blood and pulverized limestone. Right eye swollen shut. Flight suit torn, revealing bruising the size of a dinner plate spreading down her shoulder. "Ma'am, we need a litter," a medic said. "I can walk." Her voice was raw sandpaper but absolute. She slid off the bench, knees buckling before locking. She grabbed the Macmillan TAC-50. "I got it," Hound said, stepping forward. "No mockery now. No, it's my weapon." She dragged the rifle down the ramp, bipod legs screeching metal. 7 giants walked behind a woman who looked like a child broken by war. The Joseek was sterile cold. Major Phillips sat behind a table, clean-shaven, smelling of coffee. "Commander Phillips," said, looking at Morrison, "you're claiming 3 vehicles destroyed, 11 KIA, but air support waved off. Who engaged?" "Overwatch engaged," Morrison said. Phillips squinted. "Engagement ranges 2,000 to 3,000 meters. 0 visibility. That's statistically impossible." Morrison walked to the table, placed both hands flat. "Write it exactly as I said it, Major. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Emma Rourke engaged 3 vehicles, destroyed a moving VBIED at 2,400 meters, eliminated 11 hostiles, saved the entire element. Those are the facts. Chief Rourke, can you verify these ballistics?" Emma pulled out her logbook, wet, crumpled, blood-stained, tossed it on the table. "It's all in there. Windage, drop, time of flight, Coriolis. Read it." Phillips opened it. Pages of handwritten calculations, terrain sketches, wind readings. The VBIE'd page showed the terrain trap diagram numbers filling margins. He closed it slowly. I'll file it with a commendation. Outside, Emma found her Pelican case. She knelt, disassembled the rifle with stiff, clumsy hands, snapped the latches. Click, click, click. She grabbed the handle, pulled. The case didn't move. Her strength was gone. She pulled again. It lifted an inch, slammed back down. A shadow fell. Morrison. He didn't speak. Simply reached down, grabbed the handle, swung the 80-pound case onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Where's your truck? Transient lot, Building 7. I'm parked there. A lie. He walked toward Building 7 anyway. They walked in silence, boots crunching gravel. When they reached the Humvee, Morrison swung the case into the bed. The report, Emma said. Thanks for verifying it. Morrison scuffed his boot in gravel. You were right about the wind, the weather, the enemy count. You were right about all of it. I usually am, Emma said, faint smile touching cracked lips. Morrison snorted. Yeah, I guess you are. He extended his hand. Emma took it. Her small hand disappeared in his grip. He shook it once firmly. See you around, Sparrow. Not mockery. The way men use call signs for forces of nature. Reaper. Spectre. Acknowledgement that she was something small, causing massive destruction. Stay low, Actual. Morrison disappeared into the darkness. Emma climbed into the Humvee. The young private driver stared. You okay, ma'am? You look like you went through a blender. Emma leaned against the window, watching lights blur. I'm fine. I'm just a little short. The truck drove off, carrying the smallest giant in Afghanistan. 14 months later. Fort Benning, Georgia. Sniper school. CW3 Emma Rourke stood at the front of Classroom B. On her uniform, the silver star sat beside her combat action badge. 12 students faced her, 11 men, and Corporal Madison Hayes, 5'1", arms crossed, expecting dismissal. I'm CW3 Rourke. Some call me Sparrow before we start a story. She told them. The ridge, the haboob, the impossible shots. Clinical, factual, just math and outcome. Ma'am, the student asked, how do you make 3,000-meter shots in a sandstorm? Emma wrote on the board, when numbers fail, listen to what the mountain is telling you. My grandfather wrote that in 1959. He taught himself because nobody would teach him. Decades after he died, I learned from his words. Hayes raised her hand. Ma'am, I'm scared I'm too small for this course. Emma saw herself at every stage someone said she couldn't. Size isn't weakness, it's specialization. You're built for crevices where big men can't fit. She held up her grandfather's paper. 70 years old, Sarnum, Thomas Rourke, self-taught. When he died in 2003, I inherited it. I learned from a man I never met. She placed it on the desk. He taught me. I'm teaching you. Someday you'll teach someone else. That's how we survive. Not through size or strength, but knowledge passed down. The legacy continues, Hayes said softly. Always. Now everyone outside, we're learning the old way, no computers. Just your finger, your eyes, your brain. The class filed out. Emma followed into Georgia Heat. She thought about Morrison's recommendation letter. Brennan's weekly calls. Her grandfather's words that saved 7 lives. The smallest giant, recognition that size and impact were not correlated. That the deadliest things came in smallest packages. She stepped into sunlight and began to teach.